Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Porterfield, the CEO of the Aspen Institute. So thank you all for being here today for our Foundation Presidents Roundtable. And I'd like to thank my colleagues in the Office of Institutional Advancement at the Institute for hosting today's discussion, along with our program on philanthropy and social innovation led by Jane Wales. And a big thanks to our guest, Mike Kubzansky, who's the CEO of the Omidyar network. The purpose of the Aspen Institute is to create or help create a free, just, and equitable society. And this has been our guiding vision for more than 70 years. Those terms, of course, free, just, equitable, require continuous discussion and interpretation as the world changes and the context in which we work change, and as we ourselves change. But we pursue this vision by driving development, positive development in the world in many different ways. The Aspen Institute focuses on building networks, on developing leaders, on hosting major convenings for inclusive dialogue, and on solutions-oriented action that takes many different forms across a wide array of interconnected issues. Today, we have a particular pain in our heart because of the assault on people, democracy, freedom, and human rights in Ukraine. Some of you may know that the Aspen Institute has a global network of Aspens or partners around the world. There are 12 in addition to Aspen USA. The first was Aspen Germany, founded about 30 years ago. The most recent, Aspen Great Britain, which came in after Brexit. We have an Aspen India, an Aspen Mexico, an Aspen Romania, an Aspen Central Europe, and more. And about 7 years ago, we founded Aspen Kyiv in Ukraine. There are 9 colleagues that work for Aspen Kyiv. They're dispersed across the country. A number of them have been able to leave, although men who between the ages of 18 and 64 cannot leave. Those that have left are being assisted greatly by our Aspens in Romania and Central Europe. The world is watching with horror and outrage as this attack on everyday people and on democracy in form and spirit occurs and seems to worsen with the day. We at the Institute are trying to support our colleagues by devoting funds donated by the staff of the Institute and our trustees, by trying to maintain open lines of communication to support any way we can. We also have some employees of the Institute who are recent arrivees in the United States from Ukraine. We're working to help them and their families too. I know you are all in your different ways. Overall, as a nonprofit organization, we couldn't do anything without the support of the philanthropic sector. You are a key partner to our efforts to make the world a better place. And we learned so much from your evolving understanding of your mission and how you can make the best impacts in the world. It really is a partnership in everything we do. And that's why we're so excited to hear from Mike today and learn more about the path-breaking organization Omidyar Network, which has evolved itself over the years, has supported and continues to support a wide range of critical work across the country and I think the world, and certainly at the Institute, where the Omidyar Network has supported our work on the intersection of technology, media, and democracy, on global economic development, entrepreneurship, on inclusive capitalism, on scaling 2-generation solutions to preventing generational poverty and inequity. Mike will be in conversation with our leader, Jane Wales, director of our program on philanthropy and social innovation, which works to strengthen the relationship between philanthropy and civil society with a fantastic team of colleagues. Jane has had a very distinguished career in government, having served as special assistant to the president, senior director of the National Security Council in the Clinton administration, also as deputy director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and as a deputy assistant secretary of state. Now, over to Jane to introduce Mike and lead the conversation. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thanks for opening this conversation. I'm struck by the degree to which Omidyar Network shares the goals of a free, just, and equitable society, not just here, but abroad. And just wanted to just mention for those of us on this call, Dan, since he's been CEO for several years now, has urged us to tackle big, hairy problems, including the very ones that Mike is focused on. That is to say, strengthening our democracy, working for an inclusive economy, but also looking at the role of technology in our society and some of the harms it causes, some of the benefits it brings. So there's a lot of there are a lot of similarities between things that have mattered to us at the Institute and what matters to Omidyar Network. Just a word about Mike Kubzansky. He's got a pretty remarkable resume and ranges of expertise. So I'm going to refer you to the chat box for most of this. But he was originally was in charge of intellectual capital at Omidyar Network before being named CEO. And prior to joining Omidyar Network, he was at Monitor. He was a partner at Monitor Group, which is now known as Monitor Deloitte. And in his role there, he was a true expert in big emerging markets in various areas of technology, telecom, satellite, internet, and was mostly focused on the Southern Hemisphere, but was global as well. Prior to that, he was at the World Bank and its international, in its finance group, which is the part of the World Bank that invests in for-profit companies, small and medium-sized companies, and so he's played a role both in the public and private, and now the philanthropic sector. So welcome, Mike. Why don't you join us? Hey, Mike, thanks for joining us. I'm just going to just ask you about, maybe say a word about the kind of the philosophy of Omidyar Network, because it's often referred to as kind of trying to address problems at their source. Don't wait for the manifestations of that problem, but get to that source, and work at the level of ideas, the levels of rules, institutions, and at the level of power, of people power in particular. So Mike, say a word about the kind of the philosophy and how you think about problems as you seek to address them at Omidyar Network.
Good. I'll get to that in a second, but first, Jane, thank you. Dan, thank you. Thanks to the Aspen team for putting this. Thanks to everybody who's here with us today. Appreciate your joining us. I hope we can make it worth your hour. And I do want to acknowledge what Dan opened with. This is overhanging all of this discussion is this terrible tragedy, unjust war in Ukraine. And while that's not something we directly work on, it weighs heavily on all of us, as it should, because the very institutions of democracy and freedom and liberalism are kind of at stake here. And so I don't want to minimize the stakes. We're not going to talk too much about it today, but I did want to acknowledge that and say that I know all my colleagues at Omidyar Network, our hearts and our prayers are, hoping for the right outcome and a swift end to this process. So with that, Jane, let me turn to your question in terms of like how we think, and it's probably good to just start back at kind of first principles. In 2018, we did a pretty substantial reset of our strategy and approach. And there we really wanted to think about, and we've always been engaged at the systems level, right? We've always had a kind of a systems orientation. And we thought a lot about sort of three systems and forces that are really driving disruption in the 21st century. And that's our economy, technology, and demographics. And those are sources of driving tremendous disruption in our world. And the real question is, how do you turn those disruptions into opportunities, not just for a few, but for the many, right? And so that's been sort of the underlying thesis about why we picked the three areas that we work on. And so how do you build a system where these disruptions can be turned to the benefit of people, and how do we work with the gravity of that and in service of a pluralistic world to make that happen? So those are hardly the only disruptions out there. As we've seen, geopolitics are massively disruptive. Climate is a huge source of disruption as well. But I think the thinking there was taking a look at what are some of the drivers of the 21st century at big systems levels. How do you get a handle on those, and how do you make those work to build real opportunity? And I think where we landed was to do that well, you really need to not just do kind of solutions at scale, but you really need to think upstream in the system to the ideas and mindsets and sort of power dynamics and rules that govern these systems and that drive them. So we have settled on this sort of triad that we've written about occasionally in terms of ideas, rules, and power. And what do we mean by that? By ideas, we talk about ideas like what people refer to as neoliberalism, for instance, which is a set of ideas about the role of government and markets that have enormous sway about the rest of sort of the economic common sense that we bring to bear on our problems, and what the solution set, what are the actual solution sets you can think about. You can think in the world of what we call responsible technology. There are ideas about data, for instance, that data is somehow oil that can be permissioned off and sold. And that drives a lot of the current internet ecosystem. You can think a lot about the ideas about the internet itself, which actually came of age in the 1990s under this kind of neoliberalism set of beliefs about that, somehow the internet should have there's no role for government or governance in in that, and the laws are literally written by Newt Gingrich that govern sort of the internet era and its regulation today. So there's a set of things that are that we think are very important to get in terms of these ideas, which are ideas can be innovations per se, but we think of more as these, what are the mindsets and kind of the governing sort of intellectual operating system underneath all of these things. In our work on pluralism and belonging, we think a lot about the idea, which I think Heather McGee has done an enormous job, for instance, to talk about that there's somehow zero sum, that if my group is to succeed, it's a zero sum game, and other groups can't, any gain from one group versus another is somehow at my expense. That's an idea, that's a mindset that's deeply held, but can and ultimately should be changed. So when we talk about ideas, we talk about these sort of mindsets. When we talk about power, Jane, exactly as you mentioned, we talk about power, whether in the form of checks on power. So again, from a democracy frame, and our founders had a strong belief in checks on power, whether it's government power or in the private economy. So where are the checks on monopoly power in the economy? Where are the checks on and checks on power can also come from competition and healthy competition. One of the things we've noticed is that the rate of startups pre-COVID, the rate of startups in the United States, the startup formation was down 15-16% from 2004 to 2019, right? That's a check on power if you have vibrant, competitive economic systems. And so we think about power, and we think also about power, about who's got power, who's at the table. We think about things like worker power, where grassroots groups and communities have voice and power to articulate and participate in the economy. And so that's sort of the second pillar that we've kind of tried to think, again, upstream in terms of the institutional architecture and sort of who's at the table and whose voice is in the conversation. And the third is rules. When ideas meet power, you get rules. And so what are the laws, policies that then change power, shift power, check power, that instantiate ideas, that try new ideas, and that set of things. So that's been the broad sort of intellectual architecture for what we do. And I can take you through kind of how that shows up in each of our themes.
Let's start with the big idea of, or the idea that needs to be beaten, and that's the idea of neoliberalism, and give us and its bias toward the minimal government intervention in the economy. What tools does the sort of Milton Friedman approach to the world? What tools does it give us for addressing problems in the economy, or problems that are kind of baked into the economy, like global warming, like growing inequality? What tools do we have at our disposal under neoliberalism or under a different idea?
Yeah, well, I think we would argue that and did argue that neoliberalism is past its sell-by date. And I think we saw that in 2008, right? But the real question is, so we disagree with Friedman about almost everything, but he did have one thing right, which is that it is really important to have the ideas lying around for when a crisis hits, right? So in the 70s, when we saw stagflation and people started looking for a new way, new answers to the economy, there's this famous story about how Margaret Thatcher, who just took over the Tory party, her advisors walk into Friedrich Hayek's apartment in his retirement in London and said, "Hey, we're looking for some new ideas." And Friedrich's like, "Great. We've been working on this for 50 years. Here you go. Here's the kit." And I like to share a letter that, Thatcher wrote back to Hayek as kind of example of the sort of the powers of ideas. But they had been working on this for sort of 40, 50 years. And I think when 2008 came and the crisis came, there's a recognition that the system is fundamentally not working and is fundamentally broken, but the alternatives have not been well articulated enough. And so I think since 2008, 2009, you've seen this in the response to the COVID crisis. A lot of work has been done, right? As well as retrospective on how we didn't respond well enough in the 2008, 2009 crisis. So I think that's informed things, but I still think we have work to do in articulating a short, sharp version of what neoliberalism can be brought down to: small government, low taxes, individual freedom. Our new view does not yet have that pithy kind of three phrase summary that can equally guide a set of choices underneath it, even though there's a lot of bottom-up activity in that direction, and there's a lot of great thinking. For instance, Bloomberg has a fantastic piece on Derek Hamilton that came up yesterday, for instance, who's somebody we fund and love at the New School. So the ideas are coming out there, but it has to come together in a cogent thesis that gives people some common sense, as our friends at the Hewlett Foundation call it, to kind of guide their choices. So I think the current neoliberalist paradigm is past its sell-by date, but as exactly, Jane, as you said, it really contributes to, it's driven massive inequality, and which is very corrosive for our democracy and for our economy. It's driven and increased the racial wealth gap. It has declined. One of the most important and undertold stories, I know Aspen works on this, is economic mobility. Right, the decline in economic mobility saps hope and optimism from everybody, in the economy, and actually there are a number of European economies that now have more economic mobility than ours, believe it or not. So I think the evidence as to why neoliberalism and the startups rates, as I mentioned before, are down, right? You pride ourselves in being the startup capital of the world. And yet that's been declining. So I think the evidence as to what neoliberalism has done to the economy is, I think, fairly obvious. But I think one of my learnings in philanthropy is that it's not simply enough to point out the evidence, right? If evidence alone made the case, the child tax credit would have been renewed, on the spot, right? The evidence is overwhelming in terms of lifting families out of child poverty, children out of poverty and families. And so there's clearly more to it, and that gets back to mindsets and beliefs and values, right? People come back to these values about freedom and about these other things, which we need to do a better job of connecting. How does a different economic settlement and a different economic worldview promote freedom, and a different version of freedom, not neoliberal freedom, but a freedom to, not just a freedom from, in the words of everybody from Amartya Sen to Martha Nussbaum to Danielle Allen. So I think there's our new economic paradigm work, we tend to focus a lot on think tanks like Roosevelt Institute or Demos or Washington Center for Equitable Growth, academics like Derek Hamilton, who can translate the new ideas coming out of the academy into policy. We recently made a grant. We've also supported new economic curriculum that's been led by some scholars in various places, from Columbia to UCL to Harvard and Santa Fe. We made a grant as a part of this broader economic thinking consortium with Hewlett and OSF and Ford to Santa Fe Institute. It's part of a broader consortium to kind of rethink the ideas that need to be changed, both at the academy and how people learn ideas. Somebody taught Paul Ryan economics, and someone will teach the next Paul Ryan or Nancy Pelosi economics as well. And how do we get a fuller understanding of economics that takes into account our understanding of human behavior and people has expanded dramatically since the 70s, but we're still teaching economics without any of these insights from psychology, from behavioral economics, from evolutionary biology, that people are fundamentally cooperative. And so it's going to be it takes a long time to dislodge a paradigm. Crises are good moments when they happen. And that might be the only thing crises are good for. But but it's long-term work. And so the paradigm work takes enormous time and takes a lot of thought, and takes not just net present values, right? It's going to need, there's narrative components, there's values components, there's non-rational components that are as important as just the assertions of fact.
And the new paradigm also takes foresight. And you and Omidyar Network, Hewlett Ford, I just think there are in fact 10 different major foundations engaged in this work with you. You all started long ago, and you often refer to something called the Overton Window, or that's that window of opportunity, a sort of cultural and political opportunity when an idea that might seem harebrained or unthinkable suddenly becomes actionable, is accepted as a point for policy. I guess what I'd ask you, and I think you kind of alluded to this about crises. Did the combination of the pandemic, the economic free fall, and the disproportionate impacts of both of those on communities of color, did that open the opportunity for new thinking and for very different actions, not only by the civil society, but by government? And were you ready for it?
Yes. I'm not sure anyone is ever fully ready for a crisis. But I'm glad to Overton for naming the Overton window, so we don't have to call it the Friedman window, back to the comment I made before. That would be better. But but there is insight that you need to have ideas ready to go and quote, as Friedman said, lying around when it comes. And by the way, I think it's certainly in my lifetime, I can't remember when we've lived through 4 once in a generation, what should be once in a generation shocks in 2 years. If you think about COVID, the George Floyd and related racial reckoning, January 6th, and now the Ukraine war, it's stunning the degree. And I think this is an issue for all of philanthropy to consider, right? Which is, in a world where these shocks tend to happen once in a generation, and you got basically 4 in 2 years. Like, what does that mean, and how should philanthropy? This is a question we're asking ourselves a lot. And how do you operate? And one of our theses has been, let's have the ideas ready for when the window opens up to consider new things. And crises are good. When COVID first hit, we commissioned a short study from Bridgespan to say, hey, what happens in crises, and what, where are there opportunities and where is there friction in the system? And crises do definitively open windows to different sorts of things. And by the way, at least through the history of 20th century and American crises, one of the interesting findings was that in all cases, more authority went to the Fed. By the way, as a sort of and if you stop to think about it, that's an interesting issue, because the Fed actually has an independence and an ability to move quickly that is not characteristic necessarily of other institutions in our society. So we've tried to work with some success, and obviously this is very hit or miss. And this is where our roots in Silicon Valley and our venture kind of philosophy. Not everything's going to hit, nor should it in philanthropy, but you need to be seeding the ideas. So we have been spending time on how do you build up ideas around, not every idea is going to move from fringe to mainstream, but we started on competition policy, for instance, back in 2018, supporting folks like Lena Khan well before she ended up running the Federal Trade Commission. We started on ideas around digital identity and the need for privacy protections around them, in addition to the rollout of identity. We started on worker power at the same time, and it's been gratifying and amazing to see the uptick in public support for unions and more worker voice. That has yet to translate into sort of really meaningful national federal change, but we're starting to see some local change, for instance, in California and some other states. So, and it's been good to see economic orthodoxy around deficits and around government spending starting to crack under the pressure of the crises, right? So I do think there's a rethinking of some of these crises are moments to rethink orthodoxy. I think one of the things we're really gratified about is the emphasis on cash and cash payments. We'd been supporting economic security program. We continue to support community change on this notion, but about the safety net. It used to be heretical to hand out cash to people. They're going to, the conventional wisdom coming out of neoliberalism is they're going to blow it on drugs, alcohol, and gambling. And the massive turnover starting in, early 2020 to say, no, actually, let's hand out cash payments directly to people. Let's not do tax cuts. Let's not do vouchers. Let's not do anything. Let's actually hand out cash. So it's gratifying to work on these things and see them hit. And by the way, I take zero credit for us, right? This is the hard work of all the grantees that we support who are actually out there in the front halls of Congress and in the advocacy campaigns and in the communities making this happen. So I think it's there's a role for philanthropy in finding, in supporting these groups, but I wouldn't want anyone to take from this that somehow this is credit due to us as opposed to the hardworking folks at Community Change who have been out there working on this for years. So, but there's some other things where the conventional wisdom remains sticky, right? And even though you're working on it, and look at the inflation discussion, right? And the kind of the comeback of inflation, where you work on a new, and the inflation thing, I worry about, because like for years under neoliberalism, we said, well, we can't afford to give workers a raise because it's it's going to kill jobs. And now workers are finally getting a raise at the bottom end of the spectrum. And we can't give workers a raise because it's going to drive inflation, a raise. So like, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. And so there's some of this stuff that's sticky, where we'd like to see some, there's clearly work to be done in terms of new thinking around inflation, and some of these other issues that are out there that we have worked on, in terms of changing ideas. And I think you need to make a diverse enough bet on a set of ideas that some are going to hit and some are not. And then when the crises come, hopefully teams are ready and they've done the groundwork, for instance, as the groups that have been working on cash have.
And these grantee organizations have played a very large role during this crisis. And I guess I would turn your attention to, let me just say that I think of civil society, I think of the grantee organizations as being the very folks that do the kind of practical experimentation that then demonstrates that something works, and then government can pick it up. But we saw practical experimentation in the case of the CARES Act put forth by the Trump administration, and American Rescue Plan put forward by the Biden administration. These are enormous infusions of cash into the economy. Seem to run counter to neoliberalism. But as you say, folks are now saying, well, if it weren't for that infusion of cash, we wouldn't have inflation. If it weren't for workers having money in their pockets and driving up demand for goods, we wouldn't have inflation. And if we didn't have this extension of unemployment insurance, well, then we wouldn't have the Great Resignation of sort of employees being given the breathing room to seek a better job. So let's move to worker power and how you're thinking about it, and how it's being experienced in the economy. And in particular, I want to turn to the role for benefits, but talk to us a bit about how you conceive of worker power.
Great, and I couldn't agree more with you, Jane, on the irony of some of these developments. So we took a look at worker power. There's a lot of people working on very important other issues vis-a-vis workers and work, right? There's a whole set of issues with the gig economy. There's a whole set of issues with reskilling. There's a whole set of issues with kind of future of work and the role of AI and these sorts of things. But underneath all of it, in our kind of root cause, getting back to kind of root cause analysis, was an observation that the way to solve this systemically is not via a philanthropic intervention here and there. The way to solve it systemically is by having more power in the economy for workers, and that they then can, if workers were on boards, ask yourself the sort of the what if question. How would AI roll out in the workplace? Would everybody be rolling out AI? AI would undoubtedly be rolling out. There's no question about it. There's a lot of benefits to be had for it, from efficiency, from making dangerous jobs less dangerous, and that set of things. But it would ultimately be, it would ultimately be done in a very different way, not necessarily to substitute for jobs, but to augment and make jobs better, different. Um, and so I think the thing that we think about is systemically the institution of having workers, a worker voice in the economy. If you think about it, corporations always have are self-sustainable through profits. And so always have a voice in the economy and in policy and that set of things. And unions are self-sustaining. And when unions had a bigger voice in the economy, we had better levels of inequality. We had better levels of social safety net coverage in most cases. Now, the social safety net has always been patchy and particularly, there have been aspects of the social safety net and in fact, worker protections, the NLRB deliberately excluded lots of Black and brown workers right from the outset. And so I don't want to romanticize the NLRA, for instance, but to say that, there's a notion of where are the institutions in the economy and where's the balance kind of more generally so that workers can advocate for better benefits. Workers have the power in the economy and in the workplace to advocate for better working conditions. And so our thought was you can address a lot of specific one-off issues, whether it's around benefits, work conditions, that sort of thing, if you can increase worker power more generally in the economy and in our politics. And that would be so the origin was from a kind of a structural lens in terms of what would it take to build more of that back. And so that has led us to things like, what is a 21st century union when there is a gig economy and there are not really some large factory shop floors to organize on? How can workers aggregate voice and get together? How do you build coalitions across traditional unions and worker centers and new groups? So we're very proud of a consortium in California that we've funded along with our good friends at the Irvine Foundation, the California Coalition for Worker Power, which is a combination of worker centers, for instance, the Koreatown Immigration Workers Association and the SEIU and a number of other players who are now working together to build new models of organizing and getting real policy wins kind of on the board. And so what are new ways of coalitions across otherwise fragmented groups? What are ways in which workers can organize? Where are there structural places you can put in? So there is a policy lens. So how do you build in structure? So we're very excited, for instance, we supported Jobs with Justice, who rolled out, speaking of like taking advantage of the window provided by a crisis, one of the positive things about the COVID crisis was the sudden and for the first in a very long time attention to essential workers, in our view, right? Broadly, frontline, low paid, hourly workers, overwhelmingly Black, brown women who have been marginalized in the economy and giving them voice and the attention. And so how do you leverage the attention to that segment of workers in real sense? So a couple of grantees that we're really proud of. The Metropolitan Program at Brookings has done enormous work with Molly Kinder and company to really highlight where the worker discrepancies are, all the public statements about bonuses getting paid going away very quietly. And Smiley's campaign at Jobs with Justice and the broader kind of Essential Workers Coalition, which resulted in a first of its kind Essential Workers Board in Harris County, Texas, which is Houston, a huge city, where workers for the first time are at the table with some structural input into policy and positions of the county in terms of how workers are going to be treated in health issues and worker safety issues and that sort of thing. So structural things like this Essential Workers Board are, we think, the sort of the way of the future. And we're excited to kind of see these kind of early wins. And I think, Jane, to your question, probably wouldn't have happened without COVID, right? That would have been a very long time coming without COVID. And someone like Smiley, my hat's off to her because she had the wisdom to kind of see the opportunity there. And so we're hoping to see a lot more of that. We'll see how the Houston thing just got started. So we'll see how it plays out. But that's the kind of innovation in worker power that we think is going to be needed. In addition to just the solid work that the unions continue to do.
Yeah. And our colleague here, Maureen Conway, leads the Economic Opportunities Program and has been working on worker power for a very, very long time. I want to transition, zero in on benefits. I mean, number one, you're absolutely right. There's sort of those who are in the care economy, those who are in the gig economy are often, or maybe more often than not, brown and Black people, and they are the ones who lack the benefits that you need in order to weather a COVID, because you've got medical insurance. Ida Rademacher of the Financial Security Program here has focused on a new wealth agenda. And part of the argument there is that and you know this better than I do, but the traditional way to build wealth is a combination of retirement savings and home ownership. And those who lack that retirement savings, those who have not had access, and we've had to home ownership, and they're pretty systematic, things like redlining that go against that. We can't really have a new wealth agenda without that. So speak a little bit to that. How do you get to that economic mobility that you say is lacking?
Yeah, and again, I think our first answer would be more worker power, right? If workers had more voice, both in Congress or in state legislatures or in their workplaces, they could demand. And I think you mentioned the Great Resignation. That actually is, should be increasing worker power in terms of seeing better benefits come in. Although, again, at the low end, at the sort of the low wage end of the economy, there's still not a ton of bargaining power, and so that's going to be hard. And one of the groups we proudly support is, of course, IJNPU and National Domestic Workers. And they've done some work in terms of how do you aggregate workers and voice and create novel platforms by which workers who are in sort of this more gig setup can get benefits on a voluntary basis. I know there's been some landmark legislation in places like Philadelphia to try to build that more into policy. And then I think the other things is, we're excited. I mentioned Derek Hamilton before, I think things like his baby bond initiative, which is now getting some traction in Connecticut and in my home, I wish I could say home state of DC, but it's not a state, where some of these things are building, and by having more assets, people will have more freedom to ask for more, right? And so I think there's a set of things about the power to ask for more. There's a set of things about putting more of a floor in place so that people can ask for more comfortably. And there's a set of, and I think there's a set of things we haven't talked about yet, but we have another work stream under our Reimagining Capitalism work, which has worked closely with Judy Samuelson at Aspen, of course, which we call Corporations, Capital Markets, and the Common Good. And the basic thesis of that is, if you were to take the business roundtable at its word, which I think is a dangerous thing to do, and we don't, but if you were to take it at its word in terms of building a multi-stakeholder capitalism, then employers should be paying attention to this as well. In terms of at least employer benefits and that sort of thing. So the thesis of that work is how do you build both the structures and supports in place so that those companies who actually do want to live up to that commitment can do so? How do you create the incentives in the economy that make it such that they will, in everything from how the Securities and Exchange Commission regulates corporate priorities, for instance, on shareholder buybacks, to corporate governance, to where are there positive examples of companies who are doing the right thing? I don't think you can just leave it to voluntarily businesses on their own. I think I think our take is there need to be structural supports in terms of power and checks in the economy and a role for government.
So Mike, I'm going to just ask two more questions, and then we're going to turn to the questions from the audience. And the first is on the data economy. We've willingly entered into this deal whereby the platforms give us access to the data world, the digital world, and in exchange we hand over all our personal data. What are the harms in that? And do we understand those harms?
Yeah, what aren't the harms in that, I think, is the better question. So good. I've been waiting for you to ask me about tech, because our other sort of significant program area is one we call responsible technology. And one of my calls to you, if you're here on a philanthropy today, is to kind of take the bigger lens on technology as well, right? Which is to say, I think we as philanthropy tend to focus in on a narrow tech flash and tech harm, and it might be data privacy, or it might be child harms, or it might be cyber, or it might be social media, or it might be free speech. And Lord knows there's a lot of things about technology to focus in on. But I think we also as philanthropy need to take a step back and think about tech as an ecosystem in and of itself. And we don't, and for some reason we don't do this, right? We think about the economy as a system. We think about, climate as a set of interrelated system parts. But when it comes to technology, philanthropy tends to kind of focus in on a narrow harm and a narrow kind of vertical set of things. And I think one of the things we've tried to do is say, hey, what is it going to take to get a tech ecosystem in balance, right? Or at least have the institutions that can ensure that the tech system itself is more in balance on its, in its activities. And so there's a number of things that are required, ranging from, and again, as going back to the overall idea that somehow, tech came of age in the deregulated 90s, with a stunning amount of, and there's kind of interesting scholarship that talks about where the counterculture kind of ran into the military industrial complex to kind of sort out what our expectations of technology are. And if you go back to sort of I found a quote from Esther Dyson, who was one of the early evangelists and was married to George Gilder, and there's an amazing quote from the 1990s, because it just hasn't turned out this way at all. She said, the fundamental thing the net does is to overcome the advantages of economies of scale so the big guys don't rule. And now stop to think about that from the lens of 2021. Like, that was the promise. And against that, George Gilder and Newt Gingrich wrote the Magna Carta for the digital age. And as a consequence, we have this kind of weird, as a society, we've recognized a societal interest in bounding and governing our technologies, nuclear power, and somehow we've built the capability to do that in government and elsewhere. And Jane, this from sitting in the Office of Science and Technology, in a biomedicine, right, where we somehow both have a pretty regulated business, and yet stunning innovations like mRNA vaccines, can coexist. I think we'd argue, because tech came of age in the 90s, we have this weird notion that somehow innovation and sort of a societal guardrails around technology are incompatible. Now, we can't possibly have both, and we have to make a trade-off. And that is, I would say, again, we're prisoners of an old mindset there. That is not the case. And so I think at the broadest level, I think we're prisoners of bad mindsets on technology. But that in addition that there's a set, and I would say the other piece on data is that data is oil and can be permissioned off and handed off, is another sort of out of date mindset. And we have actually a work stream, which we call New Data Paradigm, working on just this. What is data if not oil, right? Data is a fundamentally actually social recombinant good that is more valuable combined than in individual atomistic things. It works differently. So I think there's a set of things that we work on in tech, which are, again, what would it take to have a thriving tech ecosystem? What's the role for government and regulation, whether it's around privacy or competition? Where are the spurs for innovation? So one of our grantees is Mariana Mazzucato at UCL, who's been extremely eloquent about the role of government in fostering technologies in the first place. Why do we have GPS, right? Why do we have a bunch of things? Government is an enormous investor in technology, in addition to the financing ecosystem and that set of things. Where are the ethics and norms and transparency and Hippocratic oaths for digital technology, right? Where are those sets of kind of norms in the system? We apply all kinds of outdated social and economic frameworks to our technology. So there's a whole set of, we would argue there's 6 or 7 kind of institutional pillars that need to be kind of built up to build a technology ecosystem that would be in balance. Some of which, we've focused on in the past, some of which we haven't, but we as philanthropy tend to kind of focus on just like, wow, how's the innovations? Where's the big data for X? And how do we use that? As opposed to what's it going to take to build a tech system that serves all of our interests and not just a few.
And focused on that ecosystem is Vivian Schiller, who heads Aspen Digital here, who stood up a commission that looked at information disorder. So I know we're going to get a lot of questions about disinformation and misinformation. Just want to make one point, which I should have made earlier, and that is one of the ways that Omidyar network stands out as different from the rest is that it's a combination of an investor and a grant maker. It's an LLC and a foundation. And your reference to mRNA, the basis for the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, reminds me that the Gates Foundation, or the Gateses, had invested something like $50 million in mRNA development the year before the COVID, in the hope that it would lead to a vaccine for tuberculosis. And if it weren't for that, those kinds of investments early on made it possible to in such a speedy way develop a vaccine for COVID. I'm going to turn to one of our questioners here. It's Ann Mosley. Ann heads up Ascend, a very dynamic program at the Aspen Institute that focuses on the intergenerational transfer of poverty. And she has asked how you think about accountability in each of these areas, as an investor, as a grant maker, but also as a policy advocate.
Anne, have you been listening to our internal management team conversations about accountability? That's a very prescient question. Hello, Anne. It's good to see you. I think I can't actually see the participants, but so a couple of things about accountability, and one of the things I've learned is if we have like 100 people on this call, there are probably 80 definitions of accountability sitting around this call. So I think it's first useful to kind of clarify terms. As we think about accountability, I think philanthropy is in an odd and very privileged place, which is to say we have the great privilege of not having to make quarterly profits. And we have the great privilege, so we do not have shareholders, right? We have for the most part, we are not hauled up to testify before Congress, and I hope to keep it that way. So philanthropy's lack of accountability in some ways is its biggest advantage, and as you pointed out, Jane, the Gates Foundation could put $50 million into mRNA vaccines and hope that was going to have some kind of payoff somewhere down the road, and not have to answer a quarterly shareholder call as to why why they spent $50 million on something like that, and how's that going to generate quarterly profit. So I think we should, when we start talking about philanthropy and accountability, we should also recognize that there are important advantages to philanthropy, and similarly, philanthropy can and must support civil society as an engine to hold government and the rest of us to account. That is an essential part of our democracy and is an essential part of thing. And you would not want to leave to government to do, right? Pick which civil society groups to support and which ones not to. And so there's an accountability thread there as well in terms of supporting for civil society and independent media that only, that philanthropy has an important role to play as well, kind of in the broader structure. In terms of our own accountability, therefore, it is important, however, to be transparent, right? And so we view one piece of accountability as just being transparent about what we do. So Jane, as you mentioned, we are an LLC and a C3. There are enormous benefits to that, and I would recommend it to everybody, but you can't be in it for the tax deduction, and God bless Pierre, he's not, right? You're in it actually for the social impact, and whatever format makes the social impact work better. That means, by the way, that we can make the equivalent of C4 contributions, right? For instance, through the LLC, because as Mitt Romney famously said, corporations are people too. And so one of the things we take in terms of accountability is we publish everything we do. So you can actually go on our website, find all of our C3 contributions, all of our C4 contributions as well, even though we have no obligation to tell them. But so people, if they want to agree with us, great. They don't want to agree with us, they don't have to, but they at least know what we're up to. And along similar lines, we also we write and try to publish what we call points of view. which is, hey, here's our philosophy of what we're trying to get done. This is why we're doing something like worker power, where we've written a point of view. It's on our website. And again, people can agree with us or not agree with us, but we view that as part of our obligation to be transparent to the world in that way, in terms of publishing our points of view, so people can agree or disagree with us as they choose. Then, in addition, the accountability, I think, comes to and similarly, like publishing, then I think there's a whole conversation now about philanthropy that wasn't going on 6-7 years ago, in terms of how can philanthropy be accountable to communities? How can philanthropy be accountable to for results, and that set of things? And that I think every philanthropy is struggling with in its own way, or working through in its own way. And so I think there's sets of things about beyond transparency, in terms of what's the right time horizon to kind of evaluate success, what's the right I think what's the right kind of support, whether it's general operating support or project support, for instance, to the various groups it does with. When should philanthropy cede power on the front lines, as we've done in a recent kind of mutual aid fund grant? When should philanthropy continue to sort of make decisions? There's a bunch of things there, but I think it all starts with the sort of the transparency piece.
So on that topic, we had a couple of questions about the role of journalism. And I know that in the past, Omidyar Network has supported independent journalism. It has spun off one of its programs to create Luminate, that's also a grant maker in this area. What is the questioner asks, what is the role of journalism in rethinking the social contract?
Essential, right? Because that is still how so many people. Now, the question is, how broadly we're going to define journalism in the world of social media, right? So that's another topic that gets back a little bit to tech. And so to that say, I do think we have frameworks for thinking about, for instance, broadcast and radio, right? Nicholas Carr wrote a terrific piece in the New Atlantis about like all the old frameworks we had going back to the 30s actually going back to the Postal Service, for how we should think about speech and journalism, and and the fairness doctrine and some of these things. So I think there's some meta issues on the role for journalism is rapidly evolving. And I say this as the parent of 2 kids who aspire to be journalists, by the way. So big believer, the future of the family depends upon it. But the role of journalism in the social contract is essential because it is broadly how still most people are getting there, particularly if you're going to define it more broadly in social media terms. It is broadly how people are getting their information. And so where the stratification of journalism, into various camps and that sort of thing is absolutely essential in terms of how do you create a shared commonality and a shared common understanding of the facts. Journalism is an absolutely essential window to that, for how people get their information as to what's going on and their perspective. So there's no question that while we don't work on journalism directly anymore, there's no question, for instance, the new economic paradigm, or the current economic paradigm, is entirely filtered through journalistic lenses to people. And so the narratives people hear, the stories they choose to listen to, the stories they get exposed to, are run straight through the Fourth Estate.
We have a question, in fact, 1.5 questions on how Omidyar Network engages the private sector. When you think about all 3 issues we've talked about, the strength of our democracy, the efficacy and fairness of our economy, and also the role of technology, private sector has got a huge role to play. How do you engage the private sector in your thinking and in the evolution of new paradigms?
Yeah, so the we have historically spent a great amount of time with in the private sector, first and foremost as an investor in companies in the private sector. I think over time, we've probably put $750 million or so to work in innovative startups. And most recently, for instance, in a startup that I think Judy may know, Novata, for instance, which is a new company that's trying to bring some ESG metrics, transparency, and ethos into sort of the private economy. In terms of about over 40% of the economy at this point is not publicly traded on the stock market, for instance. And so we think a lot about sort of the broad swath of the economy and how do you engage the the private sector and the investors who also have a strong interest in the long-term health of the economy, particularly the bigger pension fund investors that are out there that own the whole market and own the whole economy. And so we've engaged a lot with pension funds and investors, for instance, state treasurers who are controlling pension funds, private pension funds in the US and Europe, to try to align their interests as investors, whether it's in private equity, public markets, that set of things, to really help them act on the interests that they have and their mandates to take a much more expansive view of the role of climate, take a much more expansive view. How do you, I think there's been a lot, happily and healthily, there's been a lot of attention to the E part of ESG. I think one of the things we engage a lot with is around the S part as well. How do you bring as much rigor to the S part as the E part in ESG? And so there, for instance, we've been long supporters of Sir Ronald Cohen and his global steering group. They've worked very closely with Harvard Business School, which is doing impact-weighted accounting, right? So how do you engage with the private sector to actually account for the true impact of what private companies are? So you can expose to them for their management and their shareholders and their board what's going on, and to their and to their broader sets of stakeholders as well. And so I think there's a set of things that are that can be done, again, voluntarily by companies. And that's one of the thrusts of the corporations and the sort of capital markets work, is how do we engage with those companies who want to make a difference, as well as, again, the broader ecosystem, whether it's Securities and Exchange Commission or, broader stakeholders in the economy.
Mike Kubzansky, I'm sorry to say we're at time, but thank you so much for this hour and for your leadership. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everybody.